Okay, I think we are approaching time to get started. So, good afternoon. Welcome to the CJS Noon Lecture Series. I am Erin Brightwell, faculty in Asian Languages and Cultures, and I will be acting as our MC today, straining my technical literacy abilities to the utmost. So as usual, I want to start us off with a few announcements. Due to the Thanksgiving holiday, there will be no CJS lecture next week. But please join us the following week, December 1st, for Minamata, Lens on Post-War Democracy and Persistent Legacy of the Trans-War Period, which is a lecture that will be given by Timothy George, Professor Emeritus of University of Rhode Island. Also, that evening, there will be the fourth entry in the Diamonds by the Decade, the Best of CJS 75th Anniversary Film Series. And that will involve a screening of the 1960 film Death by Hanging, directed by Nagisa Oshima. It will be shown at the State Theater starting at 7:15 in Theater 1. More information and tickets are available from the Michigan Theater website. For those attendees who are joining the webinar, webcams and microphones have been muted, but we invite you to please take advantage of the Q&A function to enter your questions at any time, and we will try to address as many as possible. The live transcription, closed caption, will be enabled, but if you would rather not have it, just go to the bottom right corner and disable it. Last but not least, please check out our CJS events page at U of M or our various social media for CJS lectures scheduled for fall 22. And I think we have some up for winter 2023 now. So without further ado then, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Professor Jim Reichert is here from Stanford University, where he is a professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, and he is also a PhD alum of University of Michigan. So we are happy to have him back in the familiar cold snow. So Professor Reichert specializes primarily in Meiji and Taisho literature, and he has too many publications for me to list, but I will just mention a few of his most recent. He has an article, Fetishism, Allegory, and Irony, in Tanizaki Jun'ichirō's historical novella, Bushuko Hiwa, which is in the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies in 2020, December. And he also is the author of In the Company of Men, Representations of Male-Male Sexuality in Meiji Literature from Stanford University Press. Since they're on your CV, I'm going to mention a few upcoming things for people to look forward to. He has a book chapter that's going to be forthcoming, Playing on the Edge, Teaching Boys Love Comics in Teaching Post-War Japanese Fiction. And then, of course, he has the book that this talk is going to be a part of that will be coming out on period fiction 1913 to 41, media, temporality, and ideology. Last but not least, when I think about the future of our field, I just want to point out that Professor Reichert has really mentored an astonishing amount of PhD students, including our own CJS postdoc last year, Linda. So those of you who know her, she was a former advisee of Professor Reichert. So please join me in giving Jim a warm welcome back to cold Michigan. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin, for a really generous introduction, and thank you for the Center for Japanese Studies for inviting me to share my research. It's always wonderful to come back to Ann Arbor, and I like the cold weather. It's exciting and different, and it's a novelty. So I'm enjoying it. So my talk today, I'm going to launch right into it because it's a little bit on the long side. As Erin said, it is based on my book that hopefully will be coming out in the not too distant future. And in today's talk, I want to do two things. I would like to provide an outline of the larger project. And then the second thing I want to do is introduce a section of my reading of the 1938 Japanese translation of Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, which is one chapter in the book, and I'll talk about that in a second. And so the first part of talking about the larger project, the book, the forthcoming book, explores Japanese period fiction, which is the most pervasive form of mass entertainment to emerge in Japan in the first half of the 20th century. And specifically, I analyzed the genre from its inception in the 19-teens through to the beginning of the 1940s, when wartime embargoes on frivolous cultural activities seriously curtailed production. Okay, let me get this straightened out. All right, and so let me define the form. So what is period fiction? Period fiction, or jidai shōsetsu, is also known as mass literature or taishu bungaku. And actually, in my project, I really take advantage of that dual nomenclature to talk about it as both a form and a medium. And period fiction consists of narratives set in the Japanese past, defined as the period before 1868. Most often, they are set at the beginning or the end of the Edo period, so 1615 to 1867. And they recount the martial exploits of male characters, some historical, mostly fictional, and the form had numerous antecedents that flourished in the pre-modern era, namely kodan, or professional storytelling or theatrical storytelling, kabuki history plays, and illustrated books, specifically golkan and yomihon. And so that's what this slide is about. But a series of developments in the early 20th century transformed these pre-modern cultural products into something new. One essential factor was the dramatic rise in literacy rates. By the second decade of the 20th century, somewhere between 90 and 95% of the population in Japan had basic literacy skills. And this is based on reading tests that were performed by the Ministry of the Army on new recruits every year, so they're pretty accurate. Another important development was the steady growth of the Japanese domestic economy, which by the 19-teens had expanded enough that significant segments of the population had achieved a level of basic economic security. This enabled the accrual of disposable income that could be spent on cultural pursuits, and the most common cultural pursuit was the purchase of printed matter. These two conditions, along with the importation and development of various technologies, including high-speed mechanized printing, binding, papermaking, and photocomposition techniques, resulted in the explosive expansion of the commercial publication industry, which encompassed newspapers, magazines, and books. Okay. Period fiction emerged out of this environment as a direct result of writers and publishers endeavoring to produce material for a massive audience of new readers. This audience was steeped in the aforementioned types of pre-modern entertainment, so the kabuki history plays, the golkan, the yomihon, and particularly the kodan. So they were very familiar and they liked these forms, but they were not habituated to reading the vernacular, realistic, often confessional type of prose fiction that was viewed by the cultural elite as the only legitimate form of modern Japanese literature. Sensing an opportunity, writers and publishers produced prose narratives that strategically reworked familiar elements from the older forms, most notably using stories about pre-modern fighting men in martial action. They marketed these narratives as a new form of entertainment known as mass literature. So they were very savvy about how it was presented as something new. Although scholars of modern Japanese literary history acknowledge the ubiquity and popularity of this material, they typically dismiss it as either retrograde content devised to attract not fully modernized consumer subjects, or a commodity form that trades in trite stereotypes of the Japanese past. My project attempts to complicate this conventional assessment by highlighting three central features of the form, or three central features that I've identified. First, I argue that period fiction, despite its seeming affinity with pre-modern types of entertainment, actually constituted a radically new approach toward literature and culture. This inventiveness is initially difficult to recognize because period fiction narratives do not resemble the type of rarefied literary experimentation that is most often associated with artistic revolution. Other obstacles to perceiving the groundbreaking newness of the genre include the historical settings of the works, their unabashed celebration of highly idealized representations of masculinity and martial prowess, and the fact that they amounted to a commodity. Okay, let me get this settled. But closer examination of period fiction reveals suggestive parallels with contemporaneous efforts to reimagine the boundaries of literary expression, such as the historical avant-garde. For example, advocates of period fiction promoted it as an artistic disruption that sought to overthrow the modern Japanese novel, which they decried as an enervated form bogged down, even though it was quite new at the time. They said it was an enervated form bogged down in a bourgeois sensibility. Complementing this insurgent spirit are the aesthetic values of shock and rupture that permeated these narratives, particularly in the kinetic sword fight scenes and the ruthless violence and nihilism of the warrior protagonists. These materials also offered audiences something new through their strategic manipulation of temporality. Simply put, the works ostentatiously deviate from an apprehension of time as a neutral dimension through which events unfold in a straightforward chronological order. Rather, they treat time, specifically the relation of past to present, as malleable. In some cases, the compositions adhere to the conventional temporal order in which past is prior to present, proffering the days of yore as a source of pride and inspiration. Or, in the manner of a montage, the narratives juxtapose the past and the present in close proximity, thus emphasizing accessibility, familiarity, and relevance of the past to the present. And on other occasions, these works are structured so that the present functions as a prologue to the past. That is, the historical setting is depicted in a manner that overtly responds to and is catalyzed by the compulsions of the present. Whoops. What did I drop? Okay. Where am I? So, another aspect of the form's newness is clarified by Marshall McLuhan's famous declaration that the medium is the message. McLuhan's statement is typically interpreted to mean that the technological medium of communication is more significant than the message being conveyed. This conventional understanding of his statement maintains a distinction between medium and message, but in fact, the thrust of McLuhan's statement is to erase the boundary between medium and message altogether. And here I quote him. Quote is up there. The content of any medium is always another medium. The content of writing is speech, just as the written word is the content of print, and print is the content of the telegraph. The message of any medium or technology is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. End of quote. The message of any new media, in other words, is the transformative change that it affects in our experience of the world around us. With this observation, McLuhan offers a conceptual framework for treating period fiction as media. To be sure, the narratives appeared in mass-produced typographical print publications, and their adaptations were circulated through the media of film and radio. But I argue that these narratives cannot simply be reduced to the inert content transmitted through new forms of print capitalism or modern communication technologies. Producers and consumers perceive these narratives to be a literary revolution, a new storytelling ecosystem that changed the scale, pace, and pattern of human experience by offering radically new avenues for knowing and, more importantly, feeling the Japanese past. And this idea that the past in period fiction is not about historical facts. It's like an emotional state. It's about feeling excited or turned on or scared or exhilarated. So they're trying to elicit emotions, and the past is a really powerful space to do that. And this last observation brings me to a key aspect of my methodology. So I said there were three things I wanted to talk about. So one of the main points of my argument is that period fiction, even though it seems old-fashioned, is actually new. The second is that it's useful to think of it as media, and therefore you can then apply all this whole sort of toolbox of media theory to think about it. So this last observation, so now I'm in the second point. This last observation brings me to a key aspect of my methodology. Specifically, I propose that it's fruitful to consider period fiction not simply as a genre, but also as a medium. And here I'll take a moment to offer my definition of genre and medium. For me, genre refers, genre refers to, where am I? The thematic, formal, and situational conditions that structure the meaning and reception of texts and objects. These texts and objects can either affiliate with or be affiliated with these conditions. Medium, on the other hand, refers to the technical, matrix, semiotic system, or material through which an object or communication act is realized and circulated. Medium is a useful perspective through which to examine period fiction for a number of reasons, and here I'll give two. First, it better reflects how, at the time, producers and consumers perceived of the phenomenon. They perceived it to be a radically new channel of communication. And second, it enables me to call attention to the various mediating functions of the genre. So I structure my discussion of the medial aspects of period fiction around three related concepts, and these are mediation, medium, and media. I'll briefly outline my application of these concepts, and I'll start with mediation. Working from the ideas of John Guillory, I conceive of mediation as communication occurring over and through an interposed spatial, temporal, or notional distance. In this framing, interpolated distance is essential to the operation. That is, distantiation is functionally synonymous with transmission, since distance generates both the need and the opportunity to communicate between separate points. The interpositionality, therefore, is not just a means through which the process is achieved. It's not just something you have to overcome, but it's actually the end goal. It's about what you can do in the space between the 2 points. This understanding of mediation encapsulates an important aspect of the mass literature project. It reflects the belief that mass literature texts were meaningful primarily because they connected writers and producers with they connected the writers and publishers with a mass audience. The mediating value attributed to mass literature was thus dependent upon the distance perceived to separate these 2 points. Moreover, the representational operations of these compositions function primarily as a strategy of mediation. That is, through their interposition, these narratives bridged the gap not just between author and audience, but also between literature and the masses, as well as between past and present. Now let me turn to medium. I've already provided a definition of medium. Further shaping my understanding is Niklas Luhmann's theory of the fluid hierarchy of medium and form. And here we have this great little chart here. According to Luhmann, medium constitutes a loose coupling of elements, whereas form constitutes a tight coupling. And so here on the top, you have the loose coupling, and then you have the tight coupling in sort of, and then you have the tight coupling sort of pulled out. And bold, that's the word I was trying to think of. He goes on to argue that depending on the perspective of analysis, something can function either as a medium or a form. For example, phonemes are the medium that form words, while words are the medium that form syntax. That is, depending on the function and the perspective, a material or a system can be viewed either as a medium and form. So, for example, words can be the form that comes out of phonemes, or they can be the medium out of which syntax is derived. The fluid understanding of the relationship between form and medium is a cornerstone of the modernist aesthetic project, as is made clear in avant-garde compositions, in which language serves as both a medium to convey meaning and a materialized form to be manipulated visually. And so we're all familiar with those kind of avant-garde compositions. I think I see the same operation at work in mass literature, many examples of which simultaneously employ the medium of period fiction to structure their narratives, as they treat the genre as a form that can be creatively modified and manipulated to express multiple orders of meaning. And that is an illustration from The Secret History of Lord Musashi, a work I'll talk about in a second. But he uses, in that story, he uses the genre of period fiction as a medium, but then he also manipulates it and plays with it. So he sees it as a medium in which you can achieve something, but he also sees it as a form that you can play with. The final concept is media. In their discussion of the collective singular term media, Mitchell and Hansen first note its association with mass networks of information transferal, such as printed books, newspapers, radio, film, television, and the internet. But referencing McLuhan's landmark observation that media constitutes extensions of the human, they offer a more expansive definition of the term, characterizing media as the environment through which humans perceive, sense, experience, and know their relation to the world. In other words, media is a prosthetic that is sort of attached to the human, and we can't really know the world without it. This concept of media provides a helpful lens to consider how mass literature serves as a textual system that not only provides access, but also establishes connections between new visions of literature, history, identity, class, and gender. So the third big idea, the third central thread, nope, come on. Oh, okay. The third central thread connecting my argument revolves around the issue of ideology. Earlier, I declared period fiction to be a literary insurrection. And I did this to underscore that despite its historical content, mass literature does not constitute an expression of conservatism in the conventional sense. That is, it does not advocate a return to the past. Rather, it conceives itself as a disruptive movement that aspires to overthrow the existing literary hierarchy and replace it with a new aesthetic, a set of new aesthetic and cultural values. Exemplifying this statement is a statement by period fiction author and avowed fascist Mikami Otokichi, in which he confidently asserts, and here I quote, "If I am allowed to make a prediction, I foresee that today's artistic novel, Geijutsu Shōsetsu," which he's talking about the modern Japanese novel, will ossify into a specialized form like the haiku, allowing period fiction to one day monopolize the world of letters, end of quote. Animating this insurrectionary agenda is a close affiliation with the populist people's art movement that was globally prevalent at the time. With their regular invocations of the people, the populist rhetoric surrounding the period fiction movement echoes another contemporaneous ideological current, fascism. Indeed, with its aestheticization of violence, its commitment to the notion of disruption and upheaval, its valorization of action, particularly violent action over introspection, and its depiction of civil society as a corrupt and stifling institution, mass literature anticipates and amplifies many foundational values of early 20th century fascism. The book that I'm working on, thus uses period fiction, one of the goals, to explore the knotty relationship that links, but does not conflate, populism, fascism, and capitalism. In short, the book considers how period fiction text organizationally, rhetorically, and thematically express, structure, comment upon, and trope their medial relation to the genre itself, to their status as media, to their audience, to modes of textual consumption, to the tenets of modernism, to the imperatives of the mass market, to the ideological demands of fascism and militarism, to their cultural antecedents, and to the Japanese past. So, the project is divided into two parts. Part one consists of 3 chapters. All of the works examined in part one are directly associated with the movement of period fiction. Chapter one considers the first third of Nakazato Kaizan's magnum opus, The Great Budapest, which was serialized in the Capital News from 1913 to 1921. Just as a little tidbit of information, The Great Budapest is considered the longest novel, modern Japanese novel ever written. It is very long. So I'm only doing a third of it. The anarchic masterpiece is thought to be the first example of modern period fiction. It aggressively leans into an aesthetic of violence, shock, and disruption. I have to say, when I read it, I was really profoundly surprised by what was not what I was expecting. Chapter 2 examines the most successful media franchise of pre-war Japan by looking at the multiple iterations of the vendetta tale, The Transformation of Yuki no Jo, which is also known as An Actor's Revenge. I look at the serialized narrative by Mikami Otokichi, the film directed by Kinugasa Teinosuke and starring Hayashi Chojiro, the illustrations by Iwata Sentaro, and the theme song produced by Sato Sonosuke and Abe Takeo. In this chapter, I focus on the interplay of multiple media as they interact through the story world of Yuki no Jo. Chapter 3 considers arguably one of the two most popular novels published in Japan during the 20th century, Yoshikawa Eiji's Miyamoto Musashi. In this chapter, I lean into the symbiotic relation between mass literature and its primary mode of circulation, the daily newspaper. I employ Luhmann's conceptual framework to highlight the dynamic functionality of Miyamoto Musashi, demonstrating that it operates as both a form in relation to the medium of period fiction and as a communication act that participates in the ongoing exchange and conveyance of information that constitutes the system of commercial journalism. So part 2 of the book also consists of 3 chapters. These chapters address works that in terms of mass popularity, historical subject matter, and widespread cultural influence correspond to the conventional definition of period fiction, but typically are not categorized as such. They are Shimazaki Toson's Before the Dawn, Tanizaki Jun'ichirō's, which I mentioned before, The Secret History of the Lord of Musashi, and Ōkubo Yasuo's translation of Gone with the Wind, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end of this talk. And I think one of the kind of interesting and fun things about this project is that I get to actually tackle the 2 most popular novels in Japan of the 20th century, which are Miyamoto Musashi and Gone with the Wind. So I kind of like that sort of component of it. I think that's interesting. And they're books that nobody ever talks about, but everybody has read, so I think it's useful. Part 2 thus explores how an array of cultural producers not directly associated with the movement of period fiction actively engaged with the communication strategies pioneered by mass literature writers to imbue their representations of the past with a sense of immediacy, accessibility, and urgency. And so the point of part 2, 1, I mean, there's just so much you can say about period fiction, and 2, I want to show that the movement has influence beyond the confines of the movement itself, that it's affecting how other people who don't necessarily see themselves as directly affiliated with it, it's shaping how they're writing and communicating. So chapter 4 operates, so this is the one on Yoakemai, chapter 4 operates under the assumption that one of the most salient comparative frameworks for thinking about period fiction is its relation to the genre of historical fiction, or rekishi shōsetsu, which maybe you didn't even know they were different, a genre produced by members of the literary establishment that privilege intellectual rigor and artistic merit. With its bookish tone, the narrative of Yoakemai seems determined to differentiate itself from the raucous genre of period fiction. So he's writing this right when period fiction is at its peak. But I argue that Toson's weighty tome, and it is a weighty tome, channels the media-conscious approach of period fiction in its exploration of the mediating impacts of generic patterns, historical documents, and communication networks on our understanding of the past. I also demonstrate that the allegorical foundation of Toson's account of his father's downfall, so people read the main character as the alter ego of the author because he wrote personal fiction, relies on the malleable temporal framework pioneered by period fiction, this idea that time, even though you're talking about the past, you can be talking about the present. Chapter 5 addresses Tanizaki Jun'ichirō's playful remediation of the period genre, The Secret History of the Lord of Musashi, and I'm using the theory of remediation in this chapter. I submit that Tanizaki's ironic allegory of a medieval fetishist, and I can happy to tell you about the plot, celebrates the opaque pleasures of form and structure achieved through its manipulation of the period fiction template. Simultaneously, it treats narrative as a transparent medium through which one can derive fundamental truths about the human experience. The final chapter of the book considers the 1938 translation of Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. In this chapter, I leverage Naoki Sakai's scheme of configuration to tackle the ideological implications of the mass literature movement, particularly as it relates to the Japanese imperial project's tortured relation to Western colonialism. I lay the foundations for this reading by showing how the promotional campaign for the translation sought to domesticate the narrative for a Japanese audience by highlighting the parallels between the U.S. Civil War and the Meiji Restoration. Furthermore, indexical associations within the translation itself highlight the correspondence of Mitchell's historical romance to the genre of Japanese period fiction, particularly the lost cause narratives about the Shinsengumi, a paramilitary organization affiliated with the Tokugawa shogunate. Starting in the late 1920s, the troupe, the Shinsengumi, became a focal point for narratives critical of the Meiji regime and its vision of Japanese modernity. Period fiction thus plays a mediating role in translating and transmitting Mitchell's criticism of Yankee-style modernity. Complicating the impact of Mitchell's message, however, is the fact that her protagonist, Scarlett O'Hara, as you well know, actively embraces Yankee values in an effort to overcome the chaos unleashed by the Civil War. In the context of wartime Japan, this contradiction resonates powerfully with comparable tensions in the Japanese Empire. In particular, it speaks to the conflict embedded in the Japanese Empire's simultaneously adversarial and mimetic relation to Western colonialism. Further complicating the transcultural resonances of the translation is Gone with the Wind's unapologetic advocacy of white supremacy. The translation's conflicted engagement with Mitchell's representation of whiteness and blackness thus exposes the fraught racial politics of the Japanese imperial project. And just as a side note, so this is the ad campaign from Mikasa Shobo that published the translation. And you can see that their two most successful publications in the 1930s were Gone with the Wind and Mein Kampf by Hitler. So yeah, it was a very reactionary publication house, and it was shaped by the political leanings of the owner of the company. And he was actually tried as a war criminal after the war. So my chapter on Gone with the Wind is about 55 pages, so can you lock the doors? So we're going to be here for a while. No, I'm just going to give you a little tiny section of it, so don't worry. I can't possibly present the whole argument here, so I'll focus on the section of the chapter that considers how the promotional materials assert a parallel between the Civil War and the Meiji Restoration, and how this sets the stage for seeing a parallel with populist histories of modern Japan. The publicity materials accompanying Ōkubo's translation promote Mitchell's novel by trying to make it relevant to the perspective of a Japanese audience. The most obvious tactic for achieving this is to posit a historical comparison between the U.S. Civil War and the Meiji Restoration. I don't know if we have any historians in here, but this was an original and creative intervention on the part of the publisher. For despite the contemporaneity of the two political events, linking them was and still is unprecedented among historians. So the fact that the comparison is made repeatedly is noteworthy. It suggests that there is a frame of reference outside of conventional academic historical discourse animating this strategy in the promotional materials. This comparison crops up in multiple endorsements, indicating that there might have been some orchestration on the part of the publisher. And I'll reference just one of these, sort of someone positing a connection between the Civil War and the Meiji Restoration. And I'll do this by, there are these promotional inserts that came with the book, and so those are quite an interesting resource to see how the book was advertised and marketed for its audience. And so one of the contributors to this promotional insert was Nii Itaru, who was famous in the late 1930s as a translator because he translated Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, which was a big success in Japan. Before noting the symmetry of the Civil War and the Meiji Restoration, Nii offers in his little essay this fanciful setup, and here I quote, "The author's grandfather was a brave warrior, Yushi, who established his renown in arms, Bumei, during the Civil War. It is said that she produced her novel after ensconcing herself for a number of years in his former stronghold, Furujiro or Kojo, in the old domain Kyūryōchi of Georgia." So he's just larding this with all kinds of sort of period fiction terminology. He explains that Mitchell took this opportunity to avail herself of her grandfather's personal archive, which served as an invaluable source for her depiction of the war and its effects on the home front. He then proposes, here another quote, "I believe that how Americans see the Civil War has something in common with how we view the Meiji Restoration. This is part of the reason why the novel was embraced with such passion by Americans." End of quote. With this statement, Ni clearly gestures toward the relevance of period fiction to Gone with the Wind. The reference to Mitchell's grandfather sets the stage by employing common terms from the lexicon of the genre of period fiction to establish his status as a Southern analog to the stereotypical Japanese feudal warlord. He then frames his mention of the Meiji Restoration in a manner that highlights its connection to popular literary taste. So he's saying that a historical period is meaningful because it's a topic for literature. He implies the Civil War correlates to the Meiji Restoration as a popular subject for literary treatment. This, of course, is an indirect acknowledgement of the status of the Restoration as one of the most prominent topics of Japanese period fiction. The 1938 translation's association with period fiction is also manifests itself around the framing of Mitchell's novel as an alternative history of the U.S. Civil War. This point, too, is made explicit in the promotional materials that accompanied the 3 volumes. Masamune Hakucho, a really very famous critic and essayist, briefly addresses this issue in his short promotional essay. He says, "The setting is weighty and meaningful since it is written from the perspective of the South. Although the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin is hallowed as the Bible, when compared to Gone with the Wind, its views seem naive. And one could even say that Mitchell's novel mocks Lincoln, that icon of human rights." He thus highlights how the novel's allegiance to the Confederacy compels it to offer an account that deviates from the standard narrative of modern United States history. This idea is echoed in 2 statements that Ōkubo includes, Ōkubo's the translator, in his brief foreword to Volume 3 of the translation. One quotation is taken from a letter attributed to Koizumi Shinzo, then president of Keio University. Koizumi offers the following explanation for the importance of the translation. Mitchell aligns herself with the planters of Georgia, recounting with great sadness the destruction of their way of life by the war and the changes wrought by Reconstruction. She offers a detailed account of the pain and resentment of Southerners. It is probably due to the fact that they emancipated the slaves, but we only study the Civil War from the perspective of the victorious North. We have never heard the voices of the defeated Southerners. Author Tsubukata Toshiro seconds this opinion. With regard to the Civil War, we have always been made to hear the voices of the victorious North. But your translation, he's addressing Ōkubo, allows us for the first time to hear the voices of the South. For this reason alone, I deeply believe that your translation should be promoted. End of quote. These high-status figures thus promote Ōkubo's translation as a much-needed corrective to the official version of the history of the U.S. Civil War that has been disseminated in Japan. This received history, they imply, and Hakucho states outright, leans too heavily into a naive narrative that American history is a steady progression toward a universal standard of justice. This perspective must be balanced, they urge, by an account that acknowledges the bitter grievances of the revanchist South. These references to Gone with the Wind as the untold story of a defeated nation conspicuously mirror a contemporaneous trend in the genre of period fiction. This trend revolves around the reassessment of the Meiji Restoration, particularly those forces that allied themselves with the Tokugawa shogunate. At the forefront of this trend were writings of the writings of Shimozawa Kan and Hirao Michio. Shimozawa was the grandson of a loyal Tokugawa retainer who had fought to defend the shogunate against the imperial army, the Meiji army. He grew up hearing a version of the Meiji Restoration that honored the courage of the Tokugawa forces and harbored a resentful grudge against the victorious Meiji regime. Shimozawa channeled this perspective into his popular compositions about the Shinsengumi, a military corps established by the Tokugawa shogunate in 1863 to keep peace in Kyoto during the chaotic last days of the Edo period. Under the leadership of Serizawa Kamo, So in Japanese order here, Kondo Isami and Kondo's faithful lieutenant, Hijikata Toshizo, the troop maintained a conspicuous and bloody presence in the city. The private army cracked down brutally on the masterless samurai who flooded Kyoto to support efforts by the imperial court to overthrow the shogunate. In addition, members of the Shinsengumi terrorized residents of the city, butchering anyone thought to exhibit disrespectful behavior. They also engaged in criminal activity, extorting money from local merchants. And they regularly succumbed to internal conflicts between different factions of the troop. Authority on period fiction Ozaki Hotsuki explains that until the mid-1920s, the Shinsengumi, they're very popular now, but they occupied a peripheral place in the Japanese historical imagination. He attributes this to the fact that historical accounts of the Restoration, until that point, largely adhered to the perspective of the victorious Meiji regime. So you can see the parallel I'm setting up. The Shinsengumi, when it was mentioned at all, was typically dismissed as a band of lawless ruffians. This began to change, however, with the rise of period fiction in the 1920s. Indeed, this renewed interest in the Shinsengumi relates to the way that period fiction marketed itself as the people's history, not official history sanctioned by elites. Period fiction advocate and firebrand Shirai Kyoji specifically refers to this agenda when he addresses the importance of reintroducing the Shinsengumi to popular audiences. The Shinsengumi is excluded from the history curriculum. It is mostly ignored in history textbooks and chronologies. History thus has the power to disregard the reality of the people. It is therefore incumbent upon us to dig deep into our own past and produce a history that captures the feelings of the people. So he's very interested in the emotions. For Shirai, then, tales of the Shinsengumi epitomize his vision of populist history as an emotive time-space that resonates viscerally with the people. Shimozawa's reassessment of the late Edo paramilitary group taps into this same sensibility. So remember, Shimozawa is one of the two figures who became famous writing about Shinsengumi. Between 1928 and 1935, he published 4 popular accounts of the Shinsengumi. Collectively, they endeavored to overturn the official view of the Shinsengumi as a band of unruly thugs, offering instead an admiring representation of the troop as men of courage and honor, loyal to the old regime, attentive to tradition, quick to respond to perceived insults, and subject to bloody fits of rage. As befitting a text closely adjacent to the popular period narrative, Shimozawa's account also devotes particular attention to the many ferocious conflicts in which the troop played a part. For example, he returns on multiple occasions to the infamous 1867 Abura no Koji incident, in which the Shinsengumi brutally purged disloyal members of the troop. Shimozawa gleefully describes the bloody scene that greeted passers-by the next morning when they came upon the site of the skirmish. In addition to the 4 bodies, the ground was littered with severed fingers, the doors and gates of the nearby houses were spattered with blood, and bits of flesh and hair adhered to the walls. Shimozawa also describes in detail the troops' elaborate code of honor, any infraction of which was punished by death, and their extreme training drills, which included regular practice bouts using actual swords and resulted in many fatalities among the troop. Another central figure in the effort to redeem the reputation of the Shinsengumi was the historian Hirao Michio, who also published a popular account of the troop in 1928. Although slightly more academic in tone and style, Hirao's narrative strikes many of the same notes as Shimozawa's. But even more than Shimozawa, Hirao leans into the notion that the violence and bloodshed perpetrated by the Shinsengumi was always motivated by a set of higher ideals. Hirao argues vociferously that despite their alignment with the shogunate, the Shinsengumi harbored no hostility toward the emperor. This was especially the case with their leader Kondo, who Hirao lionizes as a man here, I quote, overflowing with sincere reverence for the emperor and a sense of remorse for the nation, or yukoku. Significantly, this expression, remorse for the nation, or yukoku, was a key trope in reactionary and fascist rhetoric in Japan in the 1920s and 1930s. It was often used as a justification for violence. Hirao's account of the Shinsengumi echoes the sentiment. He explains that Kondo and his followers were disgusted by the self-interested elites who exploited the emperor and refused to protect imperial lands, kokoku, from pollution by foreigners. The troop, he suggests, was equally determined to police the loyalties of its members, brutally purging apostates from its ranks. It was this fixation on purity, then, both racial and ideological, that justified their bloody violence. Hirao's vision of the Shinsengumi thus provocatively echoes the talking points of contemporaneous reactionary activists who looked back to the Meiji Restoration as a precedent for the Showa Restoration, in which the Showa Restoration, in which it was imagined that a burst of violence could spiritually renew the Japanese nation. For example, it anticipates the sensibility of a manifesto circulated by terrorists who perpetrated the 1932 May 15th incident. Their statement climaxes with this incitement to purifying bloodshed. And here I quote, "In the name of the emperor, slaughter the traitorous advisors, kill the politicians and industrialists. They are the enemy of the people. Punish the oppressive authorities, root out the scoundrels and members of the privileged class, protect the lands of our forefathers. With your help, we will light the flames of the Shoah Restoration." End of quote. When viewed in conjunction with this kind of extreme political discourse, the reactionary undertones of these revisionist histories of the Shinsengumi become clearer. In particular, their commitment to the principle of cathartic violence as a legitimate means to realize one's values aligns with the belief of political actors determined to overthrow civil society. I'm almost done. Somewhat unexpectedly, especially for those who have only seen the cinematic adaptation of Gone with the Wind, the way these revisionist histories of the Shinsengumi link bloodshed and violence with a larger proto-fascist agenda also strikes a chord with Mitchell's vision of the Old South. This propensity towards violence is everywhere in the narrative, from the casual honor shootings and stabbings perpetrated against one another by the young men in Scarlett's antebellum circle to the ferocious attack by Scarlett's friends and family on black freedmen, carpetbaggers, and scalawags after the war. Scarlett addresses this feature of Southern white culture as she contemplates a double murder committed by a childhood friend whom she and her second husband, Frank, helped flee to Texas. Here's the quote. "Gerald's blood was in her violent blood. She remembered her hot joy in shooting the marauding Yankee. Violent blood was in them all, perilously close to the surface, lurking just beneath the kindly exteriors. All of them. All the men she knew, even the drowsy-eyed Ashley and the fidgety old Frank, were like that underneath, murderous, violent if the need arose. Even Rhett, conscienceless scamp that he was, had killed a Negro for being uppity to a lady." As this last statement suggests, the people in Scarlett's orbit are every bit as touchy and combative as the warriors in the Shinsengumi. More importantly, echoing Hirao's revisionist history of the troop, their violence is sparked by the perception that their homeland has been corrupted by malevolent powers that must be violently expurgated. The difference is the final reference to, as the final reference to Rhett suggests, is that in Gone with the Wind, the violence of the characters is principally linked to the ideology of white supremacy. And this justification of brute force as a means to sustain racial purity reveals the adjacency of Mitchell's narrative to the fascist rhetoric that circulated in the United States by the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s and 1930s. So the rest of the chapter builds on this parallel and considers how the translation endeavors to process the white supremacist values and the anti-black language of Mitchell's original text. I suggest that the Japanese version attempts to assert a commensurable relation between the white characters in the novel and the modern Japanese reading audience. At the same time, the translation's treatment of anti-black racial epithets reflects a more complex and inconsistent attitude toward white supremacist racial hierarchies. The nature of Mitchell's source text made it impossible for the Japanese promoters and translators to avoid confronting this contradiction. They had to grapple with the distinctive blend of insurrectionary anti-modernism, opportunistic utilitarianism, gauzy nostalgia, and overt white supremacy in Gone with the Wind. The publisher and the translator might propose an equivalence between the Confederacy's struggle against Yankee hypocritical materialism and Imperial Japan's challenge to Western modernity. There's a large section in the chapter that does that. It might also celebrate and identify with Scarlett's strategic adoption of the enemy's strengths to boost her status. There's a section in the chapter that deals with that. But these paths of identification are inevitably tethered to the relentless racism of the novel. The twists and turns of the translation reveal that this racism, manifest as both white supremacy and anti-black hostility, was challenging for the Japanese translation to metabolize. The process involves an almost impossible balancing act. That the text cannot totally succeed in squaring the circle exposes a rankling awareness that of this fundamental problem. In the case of the Japanese Empire, dreams of contesting the West, its vision of modernity, and its staunch commitment to white supremacy cannot be separated from the translation of these structures of repression and discrimination to the context of Japan. Thank you. All right. Hopefully there are some questions, which I'm happy to fill in sections of the chapter that I just briefly alluded to.
Questions from the audience, and I know that Jillian has been encouraging people in the virtual audience to send in their questions, so please flag Yuri or me if you are in the physical audience. All right, we got a cluster over here.
Okay, thank you, Erin.
So I know from like previous readings that Japanese fascism was really tied to like agrarianism, the fetishization of like the pre-industrial like community and stuff like that, especially in the Northeast. Do you think there's any ties that can be seen between that kind of tie to Japanese fascism along with like the agrarian plantation like obsession of the South in the antebellum era?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there is most certainly. So Gone with the Wind taps into this. So it's kind of the culmination of a genre called the Plantation Novel. And the Plantation Novel is a novel that actually got started before the Civil War. And it was based on this idea that there was a fundamental cultural difference between the North and the South in the United States. And that the North had been populated or colonized by a more kind of proto-capitalist population, while the South had been colonized by a kind of landed warrior aristocracy. They're supposedly descended directly from William the Conqueror. And there was this sense then that the South was always in kind of a losing conflict with the North because the North always had more resources and more wealth, while the South was trying to maintain this kind of feudal order that was based on a vision of, connections to the land, a kind of agrarian feudalism. And before the Civil War, and there's also this really interesting thing that Walter Scott in his novels of the failed Jacobite rebellion really resonated with Southerners, this idea of gentlemen who are sort of committed to a lost cause, and then are overwhelmed by opponents who have more resources. And so before the Civil War, the way these narratives are framed is that the ideal was epitomized by Tidewater plantation aristocracy. After the Civil War, it's the cotton planters versus in the Civil War. And so, I think there's a real clear connection. One of the things that I didn't talk about, but what Shimozawa in his history of the Shinsengumi really emphasizes their commitment to a lost cause. And so he keeps on kind of talking about how they're very committed to a sort of hierarchy and culture and military ethos that, while is culturally valuable, is no match for the new Meiji forces that adopt all of these modern Western. So they're using Gatling guns and they have ironclad ships and they're sort of mowing down these sort of Tokugawa retainers. And so Shimozawa sees a lot of heroism and courage in that. So I think it's all of a piece, this idea of this commitment to a kind of value. Because the other thing is that what the Japanese often in their criticism of the West is that they really highlight the hypocrisy of the criticism of the West. So, for example, Watsuji Tetsuro, when he talks about Americans, he says that and kind of the genocide of Native Americans and the chattel slavery system. He says that Americans sort of promote this idea of equality, but they're saying, yeah, we're giving everyone rights, and so it's our right to do this as well. So there's sort of a sanctimoniousness, a hypocrisy, a materialism that's associated with this overpowering force. And the Japanese Empire is sort of trying to resist that with an alternative cultural model, and then the South is trying to resist that. So I think it maps on as an allegory pretty easily. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the fascinating talk. I love talks on translation because they often involve really fun play with metaphor. And I was really struck by the word metabolize at the end. I was just wondering if you developed that idea at all.
I mean, so I talk a lot about indexicality and interindexicality, and I don't know how much you know about the translation Gone with the Wind, but my colleague at Stanford, Miyako Inoue, has a really good chapter about interindexicality and how women's speech, she makes the argument that, you know, Japanese women's speech is sort of an imagined thing that mostly you see in films and novels. And she says, unexpectedly, the characters who tend to speak the most perfect example of Japanese women's speech are foreign white women. And so she talks about Scarlett O'Hara. And so Scarlett O'Hara epitomizes this kind of, she speaks perfect Japanese women's speech. She's talking about the post-war translation, but it still maps onto the pre-war translation. So, how there's a connection between sort of an elite Japanese woman and this sort of connection to whiteness. She makes that connection. And then there's a really interesting argument, sort of going back to northeastern Japan, where a linguist, whose name I can't remember, Hiromi, I think it's Hirata, who teaches at the University of Singapore, then talks about, because in her article, Miyako Inoue says that the translation makes the slaves, translates it into an ungrammatical form. And then this linguist says, no, it's not ungrammatical, it's tohokuben. And so they're mapping tohokuben onto the dialect of the slaves. And so again, you have this interindexicality. And so actually the point I try to make is that, so I talk about the use of racial epithets in the novel. As for those of you who have only seen the movie, racial epithets are really central to the novel Gone with the Wind, particularly in Scarlett's sort of the progression of her character is sort of the way the novel represents her kind of hardening is that she starts to use more and more racial epithets because she sort of loses this veneer of civilization that was enforced on her by her mother. And so the point, one of the points I try to make is that actually the translation can't go to, so they make this connection with Tohokuben, which there is a sort of inferiorization of that group. But the allegory that they don't make, that they're terrified of making, is of Koreans. Because there's this whole issue of the Korean accent and how that's used after the Great Kanto earthquake. So that was something people were very familiar with, sort of speech patterns. And this translation just doesn't even go there. I mean, even though, you know, like the characters in Gone with the Wind, they're subject to discrimination, they are monitored, they're seen as a potential fifth column, they are subject of vigilante violence, or they're victims of vigilante violence. So it's sort of an obvious comparison, but the translation can't go there. And actually in the pre-war translation, there are lots of fuseji, sort of cutting out descriptions. So this translation is published during the invasion of China in 1938. And so any reference to injured Confederate soldiers is cut out because they don't want people to see the suffering of soldiers. I didn't really answer, I don't know if I answered your question, but it is trying to sort of deal, it's sort of, so I guess what I'm trying to say is it's setting up a connection, it's trying to set up a parallel between the Japanese, sort of Japanese language and the white characters. So there's a connection between Japaneseness and whiteness, but sort of always complicating this is just this incredible racism of the text and how it's trying to sort of process, and sometimes it just sort of reproduces it and doesn't deal with it, and other times it does try to challenge it. So one tiny example is any reference to the Klan where in the novel it will say something like, oh, you know, these guys are doing such and such a thing. The Japanese translation always translates that as terrorism, which seems like a pretty loaded translation choice to me, that they're, so like Margaret Mitchell will be saying, oh, they had to set this up, they had to do this to protect white women, and so that's why they did this. And so it will say they had to protect white women, and that's why they engaged in terrorism. And so I feel like it's that kind of tension that's really interesting in the novel. And so the novel is making it really difficult to promote the kind of commensurability that it's also trying to achieve. Sorry.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions in the virtual queue.
Right.
So the first two are requests for more information. This is from the same person, kind of two different topics. So I'll share them both with you, and you can deal with them as you like.
Okay.
So this person asks, could you explain the background of Ōkubo Yasuo, who translated both Gone with the Wind and Mein Kampf?
Mm-hmm.
And then also asks, what is the relationship between Gone with the Wind, written in the 1930s, and the Shinsengumi rebellious to the Meiji government, but loyal to the abdicated shogunate, Tokugawa shogunate in the 1860s?
Okay. So Ōkubo got his start. So his first big translation project was Mein Kampf. And he became kind of the face of Mikasa Shobo, which was a publisher in Japan that specialized in translations of Western literature. And then his big hit, Mein Kampf was a bestseller in Japan as well, although they edited all the parts that were critical of Japan out of it. So all the parts where Hitler was very sort of down on East Asia were all removed. He translated Gone with the Wind, and sort of the scandal associated with Ōkubo Yasuo is that he actually, although he consistently took sole credit for all his translations, he actually relied on assistants to do all the translating, or most of the translating, and that actually wasn't revealed until after the war, and there was this big scandal in the 1940s when he was exposed as taking sole credit for projects that he was just kind of managing. The translation, so there also, he may or may not know this, but until 1945, there was an arrangement between Japan and the United States that there was no restrictions on translating. So any Japanese text or any American text could be freely translated in Japan with no restrictions. So you didn't have to get any permission from the author, you didn't have to get any permission from the publisher, and it was vice versa. And so Margaret Mitchell has lots of correspondence with the Department of State where because her novel was translated into multiple languages really quickly. And Japan is the only nation that has this. So most of them are pirated, but the problem with Japan is that there's no diplomatic or legal discourse, so she's kind of fixating on this. So she keeps on going back to this guy, William something, and saying, I know, why did you guys set this up? This is ludicrous. So she's really frustrated by it. But that's where she finds out that Gone with the Wind was the number 3 bestseller in Japan in 1938. But anyway, so the reason Ōkubo came up with this system of using assistants is that there were like 6 different publishing houses that were all trying to produce translations of Gone with the Wind at the same time. And so they wanted, Mikasa Shobo wanted to get theirs out first. And so I think that's why he came up with this idea that then he just sort of ran with and used for the rest of his career. About Shinsengumi and Civil War, I mean, I guess I think the point is that there is no connection, but they're trying to make this connection by saying that there's this similarity. And it is interesting to me that historians in the field don't ever connect the Civil War with the Meiji Restoration, even though there are lots of kind of interesting comparisons and similarities. So this was this idea that kind of emerged out of this populist movement that, this resentment and anger of the South is kind of like the resentment and anger that's fueling this mass literature, period fiction, this anger at elites, in the sense that, no, you don't write our history, we write our history, and it has to feel something. I mean, obviously I'm tapping into what's happening in our own country, this idea that, no, you don't tell us what to do, it's what we feel. It's what viscerally means something to us, and it's specifically something that gets us angry and excited, and wants us to tear things down. Is I think what is kind of this movement is about, because the movement celebrates destruction and violence.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry. Thank you. Hello? Great. Thank you so much for the super interesting talk, Jim, and I really look forward to the project coming out. And I'm glad you mentioned the context of the Great Earthquake and Koreans. That's one of the things I was really wondering about in terms of how the rhetoric was changing and basically like who counts as a subordinated class in this context, and like what's the nature of the interest in those folks. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, again, kind of how that might change. You mentioned like all these different kind of pirated translations, and if you see how you see the rhetoric changing. So for instance, from the 20s to the 40s, say, and then basically what happens under occupation as well. I'm just wondering, how that changes insofar as, I'm aware from work of folks like John Abel about like what types of topics, particularly as it related to kind of insurrection, insofar as you're framing that as, that's so central to the kind of nostalgia and the kind of sense of self around these people, maybe in the late 19th century. But when those kinds of topics become taboo with the kind of regime of SCAP, I'm just wondering how that changes, and if there's any kind of change, particularly in terms of these kind of internal colonies, so Okinawa on the one hand, or like you're saying, in kind of northern Japan with the Ainu or something, if how those folks fit into the picture.
So are you asking specifically about Gone with the Wind, or just more generally?
I was thinking mainly about Gone with the Wind, specifically, but if there's a larger thing about how kind of non-Japanese or kind of black characters or other kind of characters are treated in terms of what then becomes licit, to translate, how that shift happens.
Yeah, no. So I did do a comparison of the translation came out in 1938, and then the owner, whose name escapes me right now, of Mikasa Shobo, as I said, was prosecuted for war crimes after the war, and he sort of lost control of the company for a little bit, but he got it back before the end of the occupation. So the second translation, or the revised translation, comes out in 1949. And so, again, I'm going to diverge from your question a tiny bit. So what I'm thinking about right now is the conclusion to the book, which has to be very short. But my main point of the conclusion of the book is that what I want to say is the meaning of period fiction after the war, it stops being reactionary and it starts being conservative. And so it starts to be about, it's sort of nostalgic for its own pre-war iterations. It also sort of sees the past. There's sort of more of a commitment to maintenance of the past and sort of preserving the past. And so it sort of loses this kind of churning, insurrectionary aspect to it. And the way I'm going to frame that is the other really important work that has changed in 1949 during the tail end of the occupation is Miyamoto Musashi, is that Yoshikawa Eiji goes back and revises that significantly. And he says in his forward, I have to change. I mean, what I could write in 35 to 39 is no longer appropriate in a context of post-war Japan. Whether I'm also going to talk about Gone with the Wind 2 and the changes, I haven't decided yet. The main changes that I've noticed, it's just like two tiny changes, is under the influence of the U.S. occupation, actually the language, so I didn't talk about this, but in the pre-war translation, for example, the titles for the different enslaved characters they sort of are derived from feudal status markers. So like Mammy becomes Jijo, or Lady in Waiting. And those are changed in the post-war so that they sort of are more in alignment with a more direct translation of what those occupations, those roles were. The other thing is that in the pre-war translation, again, I think indexing period fiction, is that the masters are referred to as shujin, or And in the post-war translation, it goes back to what Mitchell uses. So it is shozaisha, it's the owner. So it switches from that. So, and also another thing I talk about is kind of the use, the way of translating the racial epithets becomes more, so one of the things is that in the pre-war translation, the translation uses the same, so there are two categories of racial epithets in English in the novel, and then there's one sort of translated version of that. And in the pre-war version, the translation doesn't differentiate between the two, sort of the more hostile and sort of the more, I guess, enlightened use. And in the post-war translation, it tries to, again, recognize that distinction much more. So I feel like in that sense, the translation of Gone with the Wind actually has a less conflicted relationship with the racism of the text in the occupation era translation than it does in 1938, which makes total sense to me, because I think they're having more access to United States style racism through the occupation, so they're kind of going back to the word. They're metabolizing it more easily. And also another term, so maybe this is closer to what you were asking. So a really key term in period fiction is hokori, pride. And in the pre-war translation, the translator uses hokori all the time. And it becomes jisonshin, so self-confidence in the post-war translation. And I think that is because period films were frowned upon, particularly vendetta films, during the occupation, and period literature was also frowned upon. And so I think these were ways of sort of trying to downplay the militarism of the language. And I think that's also what Yoshikawa's doing in his revision, is he's trying to downplay the militarism that's so central to the 1934 or 35 through 39 vision. So I think that they are responding to a post-war reality in which that aspect of Japanese culture is frowned upon, particularly during the occupation by the occupiers. But I guess the interesting thing is that in some ways, in the case of Gone with the Wind, they feel more comfortable completely just reproducing the white supremacist view of Margaret Mitchell, and they're not trying to sort of, they don't seem as conflicted about it as they do in the 1938 version, which makes sense because they have such an adversarial relationship with the United States, and so I think they're more, I'm sure they recognize it still, but there's more of an agenda, I guess, in sort of highlighting that, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, thank you.
So I'm going to take us back to the virtual queue.
Okay.
We have a comment and a question from Esperanza,
Oh,
who
great.
says, I just wanted to say, Jim, what a complex, meticulous analysis of jidai shōsetsu, which we have typically taken for granted. Your work sounds like a compelling reanimation of a popular literary form with such resonances to the historical contemporary currents in Japan and the US at the time. Congratulations on the new book and looking forward to reading it. Just a little question. Was Mishima somehow influenced by the politics and martial philosophy of jidai shōsetsu in his critique of Showa period worship of money capitalism and desire to restore the samurai ethos in such works as Hagakure in Wakaki Samurai no Tameni?
I mean, that's out of the scope of my project, but yeah, for sure. I mean, and yukoku, obviously, patriotism, I think is, he kind of goes back to that. So he's the outlier because and that's the whole scandal of Mishima, is that, and sort of the rage in Japan that he was so popular outside of Japan, because he was kind of, in some ways, a national embarrassment, I think, particularly among the literary establishment, because he was, particularly later in his career, because of his sort of, the way he totally leaned into this reactionary sort of set of political politics, or sort of politics. So yeah, I think he probably, I think because he was such a snob, he would probably have said that jidai shōsetsu are really trashy works, but he is plumbing the same depths, I think.
Other in-person questions? We do have one more in the virtual queue. Okay.
Thanks so much for the talk. I have sort of two half questions.
Sure.
That might be related. The first is, at the very beginning of the talk, you said that these kinds of texts became popular at the moment of sort of higher rates of literacy. And the measure you were offering, which is really helpful, is military testing, right? And I was thinking, I don't think a lot of women were included in that test, right?
No.
So I was wondering who's reading this, and it strikes me, at least now, as a book that's certainly more gendered female. I don't know if that translates.
Oh, Gone with the Wind?
Yeah.
Right.
But maybe that's just me, having never read it, right? So that's one question. And more specifically, like, what's female literacy like this time? If this is about a popular kind of text. And the second question is, I was wondering if it was a money grab. Why would the publisher, whose name you don't remember and I certainly don't know?
Michio something.
Yeah, I believe you. Why did he want to translate this book? Was it because it was a bestseller and so it was a sort of money grab in that moment, or was there something else going on? I mean, in addition to the ideology and pairing it so nicely with Mein Kampf, so that's lovely. Yeah, those are my two questions.
So I'll do the second one first. So in the ads for Gone with the Wind, so like that one I showed, so it's advertised in the Asahi Shimbun, so those are the ads I looked at. It is, this is like one of the first, I think February, so it's shortly after it came out. But what they start doing after that is they start listing the sales numbers, and by 1941, it's 2 million copies. So it was, I think, part of the motivation was, Gone with the Wind is still the second most popular book in the United States. I mean, it's, today, to this very day, the only more popular book is the Bible. And so it's a huge phenomenon. I mean, and so at the time, it also was the first, when it was recognized immediately as this kind of unprecedented super hit in the United States. I guess it achieved 1 million sales more quickly than any book ever has before or since. And so globally, people recognize that there's something about this book that's just sort of catching fire. And so that's why there were all these pirated translations happening all over the world. And so, I think why all these different companies were trying to be the first one to get it out there was because they saw it as that it was going to be a big hit. And it proved to be a huge hit. And it's not your question, but the reason the real peak of Gone with the Wind as a super popular novel in Japan was actually after the war. There is this survey that questions, they just asked people it's a annual survey about publication, and it asked people, like, what's your favorite book? What books did you read this year? And from 1949 to 1971, Gone with the Wind was always either 1, 2, or 3 in Japan. And it was the best-selling book in 1949 and 1950. So it really was popular throughout. And so the argument people have, they don't talk about it before the war, but after the war they say sort of a way of processing U.S. occupation. So Japan becomes like the Confederacy being an invaded space. It was really, so it's hard to overstate how popular it was in Japan. It was just a hugely popular novel. And because he got it out first, and it is, I think, a pretty good translation, it's always been the Mikasa Shobo translation. There's a recent one that came out a couple of years ago, a new translation, but until just very recently, it's been the 1949 translation that's being used. About literacy, yes, you're right. I have to go back and check, can't remember his name either, but there's a book called Toshikukan no Dokusha or something like that. And he does talk about extrapolating. It's harder because you don't have these kind of annual surveys or sort of literacy tests. So he's trying to extrapolate from the military test to sort of figure out literacy rates of women. His estimate is that it's pretty close. Not quite as high, but pretty close. And then the question of who's reading jidai shōsetsu, period fiction, it crosses over. I mean, if you look at sort of comments from readers, which is, again, a real marketing strategy, they tend to be pretty evenly divided between, at least, whether these are just statements dreamed up by the publishers or something, but they sort of try to evenly divide it between men and women. So, I mean, my initial impression when I was starting this is I thought, women are reading kate shōsetsu and men are reading jidai shōsetsu, but that doesn't really appear to be the case. It's women are reading both and men are reading both. So yeah, I think and something like Miyamoto Musashi, that's just, and when something is that big a hit, everybody's got to be reading it. So I hope that answered your question.
Okay, we have one more in the virtual queue.
Okay.
Wow, that was a lot of material.
Yes, it was.
Thank you for this super engaging talk. I once gave a paper at AJLS talking about how Yoshikawa Eiji in Miyamoto Musashi looks at martial masculinity and struggles against the queerness present in the samurai past while promoting a specific vision of heteronormativity more in tune with the early Showa present. As a fan of Yuki no Jouhenge, I'm intrigued by the ways that Mikami Otokichi navigates this territory as well. It sounds as if his concerns regarding the 1920s and 1930s push for compulsory heteronormativity is a theme that runs through your new research, and I can't wait to read it. Can you tell us how the translation of Gone with the Wind might have navigated the images of masculinity and male desire present in Mitchell's text? Did the translator, who seemed to be working for the conservative press, write in or emphasize the conservative early Showa struggle against gender ambiguity and queerness?
First, let me talk about Yuki no Jouhenge. So what I say in that argument is actually, I use this idea of hybridity. And so Tomiko Yoda has this great thing where she talks about how a kind of feminine principle, not a feminine principle associated with any kind of actual social role, like a wife or mother or something like that. But this feminine principle becomes kind of something that people latch on to her who are opposed to secular, mundane modernity. And that's why you have this kind of interest in like Genji and that it becomes this way of channeling through not really any kind of real woman. I mean, woman with a capital W or something like that. This kind of patriarchal feminine that becomes a kind of opposition to a more secular vision of modernity. And so that's what I sort of say is happening in Yuki no Jo. That he's sort of this terrifying gender ambivalent person who will kill you in a second, and is just and so he's always talking about these goddamn merchants. They're so greedy, and all they care about is money. And I can't wait to destroy them and ruin their families and kill them all. And he even talks about the shogun saying, these elites, they're so corrupt and disconnected from the world that they don't even understand. I'm sure none of you have read that novel, but all the villains are sort of connected with the shogunate. That's how they get their power. And so he's tearing them down. And he uses his femininity to kind of seduce them into thinking he's this harmless person, and that gives him the opportunity to completely destroy them. So I think it's really complicated in that novel and in the pre-war film. Gone with the Wind, and then I totally agreement about Miyamoto Musashi. There is this one little incident where he supposedly has a love affair. I mean, he has this platonic love affair with this guy. But the whole point is that there's no sex involved. So yeah, so it's definitely heteronormative. Gone with the Wind, yeah, I have to admit, so the reason I picked Gone with the Wind is because I wanted to have a woman writer in this project, and I searched and searched. I was looking for some Japanese author of period fiction, and there wasn't any. There just weren't any pre-war. And I kept on seeing Gone with the Wind on this bestseller list, and I don't know, finally I just thought, maybe I should just do that. And I think it worked, personally, but So that isn't answering this person's question, but that was kind of the motivation for shoehorning it in, sort of getting it in there. Yes, I mean, the whole thing about Scarlett is Scarlett's tragedy and her strength, and I guess it ties in, is that she is not a demure woman, and that's what, so she is, the heroism of Scarlett is that she takes action when no one around her can take any action. They're all completely like, I don't know what to do, I'm completely lost. And she makes decisions, and she follows through, and she is ruthless, and she achieves what she needs to achieve. But kind of the structure of the story is, in doing that, she kind of loses everything because she thinks, I'm sure you've seen the movie, she thinks she's in love with Ashley, but she finds out really in the end that it's Rhett. And it's this kind of ruthlessness that ultimately makes him disillusioned with her. That's why he leaves her. He says, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, and he leaves. And so it's sort of framing that I think it's pretty ambivalent about Scarlett in that it really respects her strength. It respects the fact that, and the way I kind of frame it is that she is willing to adopt a worldview that's a very Yankeefied worldview because it's sort of like a dog-eat-dog, totally laissez-faire capitalist worldview. You just got to do what you got to do to make money, and the only way you can have any security is to have money. And so in a sense, the novel celebrates that she's the only, all these other people around her just sort of fall apart, and she succeeds. But she loses any kind of emotional connection with anyone around her because she becomes so ruthless. So it's definitely ambivalent about what this kind of female character, I think ultimately the novel likes her, but is cognizant of her flaws, is what I would say.
Great, thank you. Well, we have kept you past 1:30, and you have given us a very rich talk to digest, so we can stick with the culinary metaphors. So I'd like to ask everyone to join, not thank me, I keep making that.
Thank you.
Join me.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you.